Good morning. I'm Patrick Arnold, the CEO of the Charleston Home Builders Association, and on behalf of the association, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for joining us online. I also want to thank our sponsors, Harvey and Bellini's attorneys at law, for bringing our guest speakers here today. As we wrap up another burning hot summer for home building, let's take a quick moment to highlight some of the current projects we have going on and challenges facing the construction industry. But I also want to take a second and welcome our newest members of the CHBA team, Quentin Bush and Janine Ibaroni. A round of applause. I'm sure you'll be hearing from them soon, and I'm happy to take care of all things membership, for discounts, networking, and events. Please be friendly. All right, now for something serious, COVID-19 and the recent surge. I know you're all tired of hearing about it, but it's important in order to keep our industry moving forward. We've been asked by our association partners in leading forward, so we want to ask you all to make sure that you are following CDC guidelines and the safety recommendations from OSHA for your job sites. We're already seeing a problem with some of our inspection departments having to shut down because of exposure or outbreaks. So please do your part in the construction industry to keep them safe so that we can all continue to keep working and fixing our housing woes. Another thing you can do to help on that front is complete the One Region Roadmap. Let's see, the One Region Roadmap Opportunity for All survey for local businesses and development partners to better understand the impact of COVID and create a roadmap for recovery. This is kind of a broader coalition effort for the business community. So please go to the One Region website. It'll be right there on the landing page. I want to talk a moment about our signature legislative priority, housing affordability. We all know it's a growing crisis in the Low Country. NHB's latest estimates showed that nationally, about 75 million households, that's roughly 60% of all US households, are unable to afford the median priced home or new home at $346,000. That's why we've produced our housing affordability policy guide to help educate planners, politicians, the public on the 5 best ways to bring down the cost of construction. So please check it out on our website, hbacharleston.com, so you can learn more about how we can fix this. BuildPAC. Wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't plug BuildPAC with election season coming around the corner. BuildPAC is the South Carolina Builders Political Action Committee, and it is more important now than ever. It's a nonpartisan political action committee that provides financial support to local, state, pro-building industry candidates for office. Please help invest through our website today. Now, enough about me, enough about the association. I want to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Joseph C. von Nessen is a research economist in the Division of Research at the Darla Moore School of Business, where he specializes in regional economics, regional economic forecast, and housing economics. He regularly conducts a wide variety of economic impact analysis, feasibility studies, and independent market research projects for clients in both the private and public sector, for which we use all the time. So thank you for that very important work. In addition, he's responsible for preparation and presenting at the University of South Carolina's annual statewide economic forecast. He serves as an advisor on the advisory committee for the state South Carolina Board of Economic Advisors, and is regularly invited to brief the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond on economic conditions in South Carolina. He is frequently speaking for business and government leaders throughout the Southeast, providing information and consultation about business, markets, and local economies. He also makes frequent media appearances to discuss various local economic topics and interest. Dr. Von Nessen earned his BA from Furman University and his PhD in economics from the University of South Carolina. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joey Von Nessen.
Well, good morning, everyone. Well, I'll go ahead and get started while we get the presentation set up. Thank you all very much for inviting me to participate. It's always a pleasure to be with you all, and especially in person after everything that's been happening over the last year and a half, of course. So again, my name is Joey Von Nessen. I'm a research economist with the Darla Moore School of Business, and we practice what I like to call so what economics. I use this term often to really illustrate the important concept of why economic data are so important to be using. Because when we look at economic data, we always want to ask the question, so what? How do these data apply? How do they help businesses and other organizations make strategic decisions? So that's really what so what economics is all about. And anytime you're looking to make strategic decisions in your business, the first thing you have to understand is the market landscape that you find yourself in. And of course, things are changing very rapidly. We've seen a major change in South Carolina's economy and in the global economy over the last year and a half or so that's totally unprecedented. So what we want to talk about this morning is what's going on, what's been happening over the last year and a half, and really get an assessment of how South Carolina is doing. Where are we in August of 2021? How far have we come in terms of our overall economic recovery? And what are we looking at in terms of economic conditions for the rest of this year and into 2022? I'm going to talk a little bit about the national and statewide economic conditions and what we are seeing going forward. And then Will Jenkinson is going to come up and talk more specifically about the Charleston market and regions within the Charleston market. So we can sum up what conditions are looking like right now, both at a more of at a macro level, at a high level, and also at a micro level, at a very localized level. And so starting out, I think a way to think about where we are headed going forward is to recognize that while we are not yet entering a post-COVID economy, because of course we have the Delta variant with us right now, and I'm going to talk about how we expect to see that affect our outlook going forward, we are entering a period of a post-stimulus economy. And by that I mean we're moving into a period where most of the stimulus funds that were allocated to help our economy recover in the aftermath of the shutdown in 2020, that is largely passing behind us. And we're moving into a period where we're not going to be able to rely on stimulus any longer. So in a very real sense, the economy is going to have to begin standing on its own 2 feet, which is a very different perspective from where we were 1 year ago. And many of the trends that we have seen emerge over the last year, many of the patterns of recovery and the drivers of recovery and economic growth have largely come about from the way the stimulus was enacted over the past year. And so that's changing now as we move into the second half of 2021. So that's an important point that I'm going to come back to several times this morning as we talk about some of these economic data. But starting out, thinking about South Carolina and how we've been doing, it's helpful to look back at what the recovery has looked like in our state so far. And the easiest way to see this is to simply look at employment recovery that we have experienced since April of 2020, which is when we saw the mandated government shutdown. And that was really the lowest point for employment and for overall economic activity in South Carolina and across the US. And as you can see here, we've recovered fairly nicely. So on the right side of the screen, you can't see it, but we've recovered to within about 2.5% of pre-COVID employment levels. In other words, today in South Carolina, 2.5% fewer South Carolinians are employed than they were in February of 2020, before the pandemic began. And that's actually very strong progress that we have seen. That is better than the national average by a significant amount. And it's also better than many other southeastern states, including our border states of Georgia and North Carolina. So overall, when we look at employment recovery in South Carolina, things are looking pretty strong through the summer, through July, which is the latest period for which we have data. Now, one exception to this trend is if we look at the service sector and the leisure and hospitality sector specifically. And I think this is the best visual representation of the current state of South Carolina's economy right now, because it really highlights the dichotomous nature of the recovery that we have seen. So quickly going through these numbers, on the right side of the screen, you can see that if we leave out the leisure and hospitality sector for a moment, just ignore it completely and focus on all other sectors of South Carolina's economy, we have recovered to within about 1.5% of our pre-COVID levels of employment. So we're almost there. And in many sectors, we have seen full recovery, and that includes the housing industry, it includes construction, as well as several others. But in general, we're within about 1.5%. So we are largely recovered when we look at the average across the state. But then if you look at leisure and hospitality, you see a very different picture. That's the major exception, still down about 10% compared to pre-COVID levels of employment. And of course, this is largely due to the fact that the service sector shut down following the need to social distance in 2020. It's seen significant recovery in 2021. In just the last month, we've seen a significant surge in employment in the leisure and hospitality sector. So it's moving in a very positive direction, but it still remains the weakest sector in terms of the need to continue to recover. So a very dichotomous recovery in terms of what we're seeing in South Carolina right now. And just breaking this down then a bit further to illustrate where we are by sector, these are the major super sectors in South Carolina. And the percentages at the top just illustrate the level of recovery that they have seen. So on the left bar there, where it says 97%, that's for South Carolina. Again, that just means that South Carolina's employment overall is within 3 percentage points, or 3% rather, of February 2020 employment levels, pre-COVID employment levels. And so you can just see the range across the board, with some sectors being fully recovered and others fairly close. But the leisure and hospitality sector, again, is the one that stands out. The two biggest sectors that have seen full recovery already are housing, construction, and then also trade, transportation, and utilities. And that's just a large sector within South Carolina that basically represents logistics, warehousing and distribution, and all of the related services that we think about for home delivery that we've all been taking advantage of as we've needed to social distance over the last year. So it's not surprising that sector also has been doing very well as a whole. Now, if we look at these employment gains and trends of recovery, one question to ask is, where is that coming from? What is that linked to? And that's primarily linked to the fact that we've seen more consumer spending and more GDP growth over the last year. And if we look at GDP trends overall for the US, about 70% of US GDP is driven by this factor right here, US consumer spending. 70%, 70, so a vast majority. So it's very important to be tracking consumer spending to get a feel for what our economy is going to be looking like going forward, and tracking what GDP growth is going to look like. And as you can see here, US consumer spending in general tends to grow at a fairly steady rate, right? So if you look at growth trends, this tracks it back to 2015. You can see the steady increase in consumer spending at a national level. And also notice we fit a trend line on those numbers there on that line. And just notice how tightly that trend line fits around the data, right? Not a whole lot of variation. So a very, very steady and stable rate of growth for US consumer spending in general. Now, after 2020, of course, we see the major downturn in consumer spending, but it has actually recovered very nicely. And you can't quite see the right side of the graph there, but basically consumer spending in the last several months has fully recovered to pre-pandemic trends. It's recovered back to that black trend line. So basically, if we had not seen COVID come through, we are still at a level of consumer spending that we would have otherwise expected. So we've essentially seen full recovery for consumer spending. Again, great news for the US economy as a whole. And this explains why GDP growth so far in 2021 has been strong, and why most economists expect for us to continue to see strong growth throughout the second half of the year and going into 2022. So that gives us an overview of where we are, where we've come in terms of our recovery so far in 2021. But of course, the key factor then is, how does this manifest itself in terms of housing markets? How has the housing market responded in general to these economic recovery trends that we have seen by various measures over the last year to year and a half? How have housing markets responded? Well, as you all know, they've responded in general very well over the last year. And we can measure this through sales activity, and we can also measure this through house price appreciation. So these are just some summary data to illustrate that point. Again, you all are very familiar with these trends. On the left side of your screen there, you can see changes in total sales activity. So basically double-digit growth in sales comparing 2021. Here we compare it to 2019 because 2020, particularly in the spring months where there's so much variation in the data, and we had such a period of transition, it's very hard to compare. But just looking at 2021 compared to 2019 through the spring, double-digit growth, and that's true whether we look at new home sales, existing home sales, or whether we look at more local data in South Carolina, the right-hand bar there. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see year-over-year changes in median house prices. So again, a significant increase in 2021 compared to anything that we've seen in recent years. So in both cases, looking at sales and looking at prices, we've seen dramatic increases in the most recent months. And so that begs the question as to why. What has been driving this increase? And the factors that have been driving this increase are very important to understand because we need to use them to help us understand where we're likely to head next for the rest of 2021 and into 2022. And there are three primary reasons that I want to speak to you about very briefly in terms of the answer to this question, in terms of what's actually driving the housing demand that we've seen over the last year or so. The first is what I will call employment preservation. Employment preservation. And by that, I mean, if we think back to the industry that was hardest hit that we just talked about, it was leisure and hospitality. And the leisure and hospitality sector, if we look in general, tends to employ workers that are relatively lower wage workers relative to the state average. And as a result, these are workers that are more likely to be in rental markets rather than potential home buyers. And that's where a disproportionate amount of the unemployment has come over the last year. And as we've also seen, leisure and hospitality has also been the slowest industry to recover. So this gives you a clear illustration of that. So the dark line here represents relatively lower wage jobs in South Carolina. The green line, the brighter color line, represents higher wage jobs in South Carolina. And this shows you how quickly these jobs have recovered to their pre-pandemic levels. The black line represents that threshold there. So as you can see, if we look at the lower wage jobs, they're still underperforming, meaning they have not completely recovered yet, whereas the relatively higher wage jobs have and recovered much faster. And so what this tells us is that over the last year, we've seen an environment where we've had relatively high unemployment, but it's been unemployment that's been more focused in industries that are employing workers that are more likely to be renters. So it hasn't hit the employment status as much for potential home buyers. And that's one reason why we can see high unemployment in South Carolina, but nevertheless see a fairly strong housing market. And remember that the single best predictor for housing demand is employment growth and the employment situation. So this is a very key metric to keep our eye on. So this is one reason we've seen such strong preserved demand over the last year. A second reason has to do with what we call the income effect. And this is simply the idea that when Americans have more disposable income, then they can spend more on all goods and services, including housing. And we've seen disposable income at significantly elevated levels over the past year, well above historic trends. Again, a very similar picture here. If we look at compare this graph to some of the others where we see a very tight trend line around the growth in disposable income for Americans. And you can see just in the recent year how that's spiked significantly above the normal trend line. Also notice that it's come back down closer to the historic trend line in the last several months. I'm going to come back and talk about that in just a moment. So both are important, but as disposable personal income goes up, more Americans have the opportunity to buy goods and services. And this can lead to something like the down payment for a house, for example. And the stimulus checks, of course, were a part of that. Again, this reflects a stimulus-based economy as much as anything else. Accompanying that, we also see high personal savings rates, about twice the rate that we normally see for the United States. So you can see here, savings rates typically around 7% for Americans, but it jumped up really in excess of 20% for a while, coming back down now to more pre-pandemic levels. But again, you see a vast difference here, a major difference in the last year compared to historic trends. So more broadly, we can think of this as the income effect. More income, more financial resources leads to more purchases on all goods and services. And then the third factor, which I think is the most important, especially for thinking about going forward, is something that I call the substitution effect. And this is the idea that American consumers buy two types of products. They buy, in general, they buy goods, especially durable goods, and they buy services. And so over the last year, due to the pandemic, we've seen a significant shift of purchasing activity away from purchasing services and towards purchasing durable goods. And so a simple example to think about that is a family that decides that instead of traveling and buying airline tickets, they save that money instead and then put it towards a down payment for a house, right? A simple substitution away from services and more on goods. And so that leads to a significant boost in demand for durable goods, including the housing market. And so that's part of what we've seen. And here you see two graphs. On the left side of your screen, durable goods, on the right side, services, and just compare the two. There's no question, right? If we compare what's changed over the last year, you see the dip in activity for both during the spring of 2020. But notice how durable goods is now well above its historic trend, whereas consumer services is still well below its historic trend. It's recovering, but still below where we would otherwise expect it to be. And again, notice also in the most recent months, we've begun to see durable goods dip, again, not contract, but dip and start moving back towards its historic trend, whereas services has started to accelerate in terms of its recovery. Why is that happening? It's happening because the service sector is opening back up and has been throughout 2021, especially as we get into or began to get into the summer and tourist season ramped up, along with the widespread availability of the vaccine, helped to restore some consumer confidence and the demand to travel, the demand to go out to restaurants, and the demand for in-person interaction. So that has dramatically affected these trends and are beginning to move us back to these pre-pandemic norms, but we're still a long way off. And I would suggest to you that going forward, this is a very important metric to continue to watch, this relationship or this economic tug of war, in a sense, between the demand for goods and the demand for services. Because as we look forward, as we continue to see this economic tug of war play out, and as we slowly see a reversion or substitution back towards services and away from durable goods to the equilibrium that we saw in terms of the distribution of spending before the pandemic began, we're going to see an impact on housing and on durable goods more generally. And we're going to see a pullback in overall sales activity for the housing market. Not a contraction, but a pullback closer to 2019 and 2020 levels. And in some sense, we're already seeing this. We already see this in the data. This has happened just in the past couple of months. And I can just illustrate very quickly a couple of slides that show you the data in a variety of different markets. We can look at the US as a whole. These are new single family home sales. Again, you can see just in the last couple of months, we've come back down closer to pre-pandemic norms. Again, 2019, early 2020 sales levels. We see a very similar pattern if we look at existing single family home sales. Again, this is for the US. And we're going to see this as well if we look at South Carolina. So these are South Carolina data from the multiple listing service. You can't see that one quite as well, but basically we're seeing a bit of a reversion back to pre-pandemic norms in terms of sales. And I think Will's going to show you some similar data for the Charleston market as well in terms of this peak and then beginning to pull back just a little bit. Again, not a contraction, but a pullback to pre-pandemic norms because we're moving into a new phase of this economic recovery. We're moving into a phase where things are beginning to move back towards equilibrium, towards a more long-run steady state with respect to the spending on goods and services. Now, as we look ahead, there are several threats we need to be on the lookout for as well. In addition to looking at this relationship between goods and services or the substitution effect to inform what housing demand is likely to be for the rest of this year and going into 2022, there are also three other elements that I think are very important for us to all keep our eye on very closely. Persistent high inflation is number one, a major economic factor and concern going forward. A persistent labor shortage is a second. And then the Delta variant, of course, is a major potential threat as well. These first two are tied together, and I'm going to go through them and link those two and show you why those are so closely connected. And then we'll briefly talk about the Delta variant. So first of all, let's talk about inflation. So inflation we've seen in recent months has ticked up significantly. Again, you all are, of course, aware of these trends. Inflation, based on our latest data, is 5.4% overall, and 4.3% if we look at core inflation, which is inflation for all goods and services except for food and energy. And core inflation is the measure that the Federal Reserve likes to use to track inflation over time. So to put those numbers in perspective, inflation typically is targeted to be around 2% by the Federal Reserve. That's where they would like inflation to be in general. And then anything significantly above 3% begins to raise a red flag for the Fed. So if we persistently see core inflation above 3%, that's when we begin to see serious discussions about the Fed taking action, as they are now, thinking about when the appropriate time to raise interest rates is. And so you can see the significant spike in inflation and how it's very much different from what we've seen in the last several years. So the question about inflation then is really whether it's likely to be transitory or whether it's likely to be long run or more long lasting, I should say. That's the debate that the Federal Reserve is really having right now. We see these discussions in the news on a regular basis. And there are ways to think about this that are helpful to consider going forward. The first is to recognize that the data currently are showing that the existing high inflation that we're seeing, that 5.4%, is primarily indicates that inflation is primarily based upon an increase in demand in the service sector, and therefore is likely to be transitory. That is, the current drivers of inflation suggest that inflation may be more likely to be transitory. And that's because the major drivers of inflation come down to essentially four products. One is an increase in price for used cars. One is an increase in price for airline tickets, airline service. One is for an increase in price in lodging, and the other is an increase in price for gasoline. And what do they all have in common? What they all have in common is that these are items that are in high demand right now because the service sector is recovering. And so if that continues, we would expect that as the demand stabilizes in the service sector, inflation would begin to come back down. And to put a fine point on that, we can look at an example. As you see here, due to year-over-year used vehicle price increases of 42%, if you can believe that, used vehicle prices are up 42% year over year for a variety of reasons that we can talk about. But it is overwhelmingly the number one factor driving this inflation right now. So 5.4% is the current inflation rate. If we just take that out, if we were to say, okay, if used vehicles hadn't changed their price levels at all, what would inflation look like instead of 5.4%? And the answer is 3.5. Still elevated, again, still above that 3% threshold and still above the 2% Federal Reserve target, but not nearly as elevated as the current data shows. So this just gives you some perspective on how just a handful of items can really radically change our measure of inflation, and how it's just a few goods that are really driving this change right now. But of course, that begs the question, how would we know if inflation were likely to be long lasting as opposed to transitory? What do we need to be on the lookout for? And that's why it's important to talk about the labor shortages that we currently have across the US and in South Carolina. Because wage growth that results from labor shortages is by definition inflationary. And so that's very important to keep in mind. So think about it this way. If you have a specific business that's producing, let's say, 100 units of output, if they are struggling to find the workers that they need to produce those 100 units of output, what do? They increase the wages to find those employees. But if they do that, they're still just producing those same 100 units. So that's an increase in cost that may be partially passed along to the consumer, but you're still seeing that same level of output. So you're seeing a higher price level for the same level of output for those 100 units. That's by definition what we call inflation. It's a higher price level for the same volume of output. So all wage growth is not inflationary necessarily, but wage growth that's primarily based on labor shortages is. And that's what we're facing right now. So to the extent that we continue to see significant labor shortages, that tends to lead to the expectation that we may see inflation that is longer lasting as opposed to being more transitory. So what's causing this labor shortage right now? A couple of different factors, and there's some good news and some bad news here on this front in terms of, are we going to be able to solve the labor shortage problem in the short run? But three primary factors I'll just briefly address. The first bullet point here, baby boomer retirements has been a major reason why we've seen labor shortages emerge over the last year. About half of the reduction in the labor force since COVID began is the retiring baby boomers. And this is a phenomenon that is not likely to self-correct. These baby boomers, many of these retirements are permanent, especially given the fact that the stock market recovered so quickly. So if you remember back in 2008, many baby boomers who were looking to retire either had to come back to the labor force or weren't able to retire because the stock market collapsed by 30%, and it took it about 4 years to recover. That didn't happen this time. So baby boomers are in a situation where if they retired in COVID, they still have they still have their savings intact, and so they are less incentivized to come back to work. So this is going to be a component of the labor force that we have lost that we're probably not going to be getting back going forward. But the other two factors will likely be mitigated in the coming months. So the second reason is that we've seen a lot of caring for family members, particularly for children. So we've been in an environment of virtual learning over the past year, which has required more parental attention and involvement as children have been staying home to go to school. And that has limited the ability for many parents to go back into the labor force. And so as we see normal schooling resume, as we see more and more people vaccinated, that is going to be an incentive for some of these caregivers to have the option to then go back into the labor force. So this has been a causal factor that will likely be mitigated in the coming months. And then finally, the higher disposable income and savings rates that we talked about. Remember, I mentioned that we were moving back to pre-pandemic norms, and that is also going to lead to more people coming back into the labor force. Because when people, for example, have very high savings, then they can be more choosy about coming back to work. They don't necessarily have to take the first job that's available. So there's more of a lag there. So as we see disposable income and savings rates moving back to pre-COVID norms, we will see more and more people move back into the labor force as we move forward. So really a good and a bad news story here. So we'll be monitoring the labor shortage very closely going forward to see how each of these factors helps to mitigate or not this shortage going forward. And then finally, just a quick comment on the threat of the Delta variant. Of course, this is very much with us right now. And the question is, what is this going to do to the momentum of our recovery for the rest of 2021? And I would suggest that the best way to think about this is to just look at consumer confidence, because that's going to be the biggest driver of changes in our economic growth. Are consumers concerned about the Delta variant, and to what degree do they pull back spending as a result? Now, as we can see, consumer confidence has recovered in recent months. The most recent month of data suggests that it's come back down a bit out of concern over the Delta variant. But this is the major factor to watch. The more consumer confidence retreats, the more likely we are to see a pullback in consumer spending. So this is the metric to really watch. I'm cautiously optimistic going into the second half of the year. One of the things that we have seen is that businesses and consumers have largely adapted to the pandemic, and this is certainly not coming out of left field like it was last year. And so businesses and consumers, to a large extent, are now much more prepared and able to deal with any rise in cases than they were this time last year, which suggests that while we may see a pullback in some of the momentum of the recovery that we have experienced so far in 2021, it's likely to be just that. It's likely to be a pullback, not a major contraction. But again, the US Consumer Confidence Index is a very important metric to be tracking to fully understand how consumers are reacting, and of course, the likely implications that may have for consumer spending going forward. So then wrapping up, as we think about where we are headed for the rest of this year and into 2022, again, just recapping, South Carolina's economy recovered very well over the last year, has done far better than the national average and better than many of our other southeastern states, and especially Georgia and North Carolina. The primary exception, leisure and hospitality, still down about 10% compared to pre-pandemic norms in terms of overall employment levels, although it too has seen significant recovery in 2021 as the service sector has come back, particularly this summer, where we've seen tourism season really ramp up. And if we look at the income and substitution effects on consumer spending, that's really the biggest metric that we need to be watching for the housing market going forward. So thinking about that substitution effect, especially, think about that relationship between consumer spending on durable goods and services as we begin to slowly revert back to pre-COVID level spending patterns in terms of that distribution. That suggests that we'll see some pullback in housing. Again, not a contraction, but pullback closer to 2019 and early 2020 levels. So that's an important metric to watch. And we're already seeing this moderate tapering in housing demand in the last few months. And then finally, the biggest economic threat going forward is the potential for long-run inflation. And I would suggest to you that the best single metric to watch for this is look at core inflation. And if core inflation remains above 3%, 3.0%, that is the metric to watch to get a feel for when the Fed is likely to raise interest rates, which would of course affect housing affordability. If inflation stays above 3%, that suggests that we're likely to see the Fed raise rates relatively sooner rather than relatively later. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. And I now want to invite Will up to the podium, and he's going to talk more about what's going on within the Charleston market specifically. Will Jenkinson has served as broker in charge of Carolina One New Homes since 2006 and has been in residential and new homes real estate in the Charleston market since the year 2000. Carolina One New Homes is the leader in marketing and sales for new home communities in the Metro Charleston area. It's a division of Carolina One Real Estate Services. Carolina One New Homes is celebrating its 27th year and currently represents more than 35 new home communities and developments throughout the Low Country and the Grand Strand. In addition to assisting builders with their community marketing and sales efforts, they also work with them in land acquisition through the company's land services group. And they also have their custom homes group to provide a high level of specialized services to local custom builders in the region. So with that, I'll introduce Will Jenkinson.
Thank you, Joey. And I'm glad to be back. It's amazing that it was 10 years ago when Joey and I first started doing this market update. And some of you may have been there at that time. It was not a lot of great news 10 years ago. And it was some challenging times. We had a mountain of inventory. For those of you who forgot, we had close to 10,000 homes in 2009 on the market, which was rather challenging, daunting questions. And how are we ever going to get people to buy a house again was a lot of the questions that we saw back in those 2010, 11, 12 time periods. Well, flash forward, to 2021, and there's another mountain of questions and struggles and challenges that we see, especially in that last 18 months we've experienced. So we're going to talk about, kind of where we are today. I'm going to kind of focus in on the Charleston level. And before I start, I do also want to thank George Seago with REIS. He helped me put together a lot of these slides and charts that you will see today. And before I jump into a more county, or what I call the street level view, I'm going to talk a little bit about some vital kind of numbers that I look at, some stats, and looking at the overall market and kind of rattle off a couple of things for you. And two notes also, we're going to have all these slides available to you on the website, as well as a video recording of this presentation, so you can watch it again, share it with others in your organization. These two are like the big measuring sticks, in my opinion. I started tracking these a couple of years ago, but every week since COVID started 18 months ago. And it's simply, for those who can't see the back of the room, looking at the MLS and the active inventory and the pending inventory. And this is as of yesterday, that we were at 1963 active homes. If you've been tracking it, yes, it's up slightly since the bottom out in April and May of this year. I equate it to simply, if your gas tank, is blinking empty and you pull in the gas station and you throw in that $5 because you're in a hurry worth of gas, it's not taking you too far down the road. That's kind of where our inventory levels are today. And we'll get more into these numbers later, but I just want to point out one really thing that I've been tracking on it. it's not just the number, but something that doesn't get reported a lot of, what percentage of that number is new homes? And what we see right now is that 26% of everything that is showing active for sale in MLS is new. I will say that's up 5% from about mid-June. So about 2 months ago, it was at 21%. And kind of a question that comes up, why the jump? Well, why have we seen a spike of new homes? Well, most of our industry, for the most part, in March, we saw the price escalation early on this year. A lot of builders retreated from doing pre-sales, homes to be built. They cut that out of their strategy, which led them to really waiting on a home, get starts out and getting to a certain stage of construction. Well, if you look back from March and flash forward to June, July, a lot of that stock has started to come back in the marketplace. So there is more new homes inventory for sale because of that timing of having those homes in those construction phases hitting. So we're starting to see a little bit more inventory, a little bit more new homes inventory is really probably half of that increase that we've seen since the end of May, kind of the bottoming out of the market. The other vital statistic that I'll watch or in MLS is the pending home sales. Those are homes that are gone under construction, under contract, not yet closed. Currently, we have just over or just under 3,900, 3,835 is the number yesterday. While that is tempered somewhat, I think like Joey mentioned, we're kind of returning to what I call the new norm, where it's a shoulder season. Well, 2020 was out of whack. We're adjusting back, and you saw some of those in previous slides that Joey demonstrated. But again, pending sales, 3,835, active 1,963. In my 20 years of being in this industry, I can never remember where pending sales ever outnumbered the number of active sales in the marketplace. This time last year reported, it was around 100 differential. Now it is up, almost 1,900, the difference between the pendings and actives. That number was closer to over 3,000 in the March, April. So it's kind of returned a bit of a normal. Still, that's amazing. It shows you the difference of, remember 10 years ago or so, we were sitting at 10,000 homes. That was our problem then. Now we have an undersupplied market. Another big thing to point out, 38%, which is a huge percentage of all the pending sales in our region, are new homes. They're labeled new and either under construction or they're finished. So that's a pretty amazing statistic to kind of highlight in those numbers. This next chart is a lot of things going on here. So I want to first thank Dave Sansom, our CFO, for sharing the slide with me. He started tracking, this is sales activity by week. So these are showing the homes that were written or going pending on a week by week basis. And you see the blue line that's 2019. So that was kind of a bit of the last normal year, a pre-pandemic year that we had. And then you see the orange line goes crazy. That's 2020. You see the big dramatic dip that we saw earlier in slides with Joey of that April time period where things shut down, sales dropped, and then recovered dramatically. And you see we stayed really high levels through the second half of last year. The second half of last year was the best second half ever. And then you see the green line, which is this year so far to date, and it's trending more closely to 2019 overall. If you take the adjustments out, it's within like 3% of 2019, which just to remind y'all, 2019 was a phenomenal year, one of the top years in our market's history for sales activity. So we're comparing a lot here, but it just shows you some trend lines, and it shows you that we are kind of normalizing or going back to pre-pandemic levels of sales activity. But still, while we were seeing some adjustments year over year, it's really looking at 2 years back and looking at those numbers to be more reflective. And still, we're outpacing 2019 right now. This next one I saw recently as well, and it kind of grabbed me. I know we hear about this a lot in numbers, how we're undersupplied as a country and a local region. But this is kind of alarming, showing the last 5 decades from the 70s through the early 2000s. These are new homes that were closed in the US. And it shows you how underbuilt we were as a country in new home starts and closings in the last decade. So a lot to make up, which really caught my eye is that 2000 to 2009. If you considered probably the last 3 years, that number dropped off dramatically. We still were built over 12 million homes in that decade, for the top decade ever, which is pretty amazing. Next one, this chart again is compliments of Carolina One, is simply showing that the top line is the sales activity, what we're seeing month over month, and then the bottom line is the overall inventory, the active inventory. This demonstrates to return to a balanced market, and balanced markets are usually defined in a 6-month supply. You hear and see that out there in a lot of reports. Right now, based on the current demand and the current supply, we would need almost 11,000 homes injected into the marketplace to balance it out. Now, those lines can change also over time, but it just shows you a snapshot in time and looking back of the issue. My main comment on this slide is, just like in 2010, kind of digging out of the Great Recession, it took, I think, 4 or 5 years to return to that balanced market. And yes, our market has been kind of underserved or in that 3-month supply range for the last couple of years leading up to the COVID kind of time period. But it has really taken a dramatic dive, and it shows you again the need. We need supply in our marketplace to return to a balanced market. The exact opposite. So you hear a lot of comments, or feels like 2006. In some cases, it does because of the activity levels, but the issues are completely different. Now I'm going to jump into some kind of comparing resales and new home sales. These are closings for the first part of this year. Today or through June, 22% of our marketplace was new homes. And then the biggest chunk, that's not surprising, those in the room, Berkeley County was at 36% as well in that. Also, I just want to point out a couple of things, some recent headlines. And I think headlines, we got to be careful as we go in the second half of this year. We saw it pop up for the first time in looking at July numbers, where the headline in the paper was sales were down 13% over this time last year. And for most of us, we read the quick headline and move on. And it caused a lot of, is the market correcting itself? Is it going down? No, it's simply just a small pullback. When we're comparing to last July, we had 2,400 homes that closed in our region. Well, we only had 2,100 this July. So while it's a setback, it's not a major setback. And then the median house price just in July was at $350, was $305 last year. That's a 15% upswing on just the home values. And then year to date in 2021, we are still up over 22% in closings as a market, with over 14,000 transactions or homes that have sold, which is on a dramatic pace, and at 17% just as the median sales price. The inventory numbers are down 56% over this time last year. So that's really, you're seeing the correction outside of what Joy was describing, some of the consumer pullback and the pullback in spending. When I reported this last year, we were down 30% over 2019. So we're down 56%. Remember that number, 1,900 plus is what we have in stock this year. This next chart will explain and show kind of the new home sales month by month over the last 4 years. And by one thing I want to kind of get across here is, to date, we're just under 2,500 through the first part of the year closing. So we're on a great pace. We're up 11% over this time last year, and this time last year had that adjustment period, but still we were in pretty good shape last year when you look at the full 6 months compared to the previous year, the first 6 months. But we're on a good track to have a good, strong finish And we'll get into some of the 12-month closing numbers here shortly. This next, what I call this is a heat map. And what this is kind of showing again is the activity levels in the marketplace for new home closings in that 6 months. Where are they taking place? That 2,487 number. Well, you see the large bullseye in the kind of middle up. That's Cane Bay, Nessen, Karnes area, kind of the hot spot. But what I'll kind of point out too in this heat map, if you look at it in years past, it's kind of really spreading out where the heat's being spread across other regions that may not have had the success in the last 5 or 6 years. The other kind of hot spot you see is down on Johns Island, continues to be kind of the leader for Charleston County in the past 5 years. And you see some activity, that North Mount Pleasant, but you see a lot more, and you see some blueness. That's Ridgeville, as you see kind of above on the kind of left side of 26. That activity of, again, closings, not things that are coming in the future, but things that are happening this year in terms of closings are starting to spread out and be more evenly dispersed is what you're seeing on this map. This next one, this is a quick one, just showing just the top 5 communities in each county. And I'm going to get into the county level. We'll talk more about this, but when you see these slides later, it'll show you the activity over the last 5 years and how they rank out in their production and position. This is a trend line showing for the last 24 months what our market has done. A steady climb, which is outside of the adjustment period. We stayed pretty strong even through the downturn. While it was so short, we had such a great first quarter in early 2020 that we rode through the closings. We didn't lose as many as we thought we would lose going into COVID, and then had that nice rebound as we got into last summer. So we really didn't miss a beat and have a major trend line change when it comes to closing activity. Also want to point out here that you see a 505 number for those who can't see it in the back of the room. That was in the month of March of this year. We had over 500 closings, and you had to go back many, many years to find a 500 closing month for new homes in our region. So that was a bright spot in the spike we're seeing at that point in time. And then you want to look at by county. So this is where all those closings this year, so that 25, almost 2,500 number, how are they dispersed between all the counties? Well, Berkeley County took half of that number, and Charleston took 30% of the pie, and Dorchester at 20. Compared year over year, Berkeley gained 5%, Charleston lost 5%, and Dorchester remained the same. So that's more of a distribution, which is a good to kind of keep up with and seeing where things are trending, which county is picking up those activities or those closings. The next trend or line is another kind of 24-month, and it really breaks down again by county where those closings, and again, just showing in a different way and you can really see the push that Berkeley has had in the last couple of years or last year since we met, while they were kind of tangling with Charleston, who's the market leader back in 19 and early 20. Post in the COVID and post-COVID, we've seen a surge in Berkeley County for new home closes, again, taking 5% of that distribution, where Charleston's kind of come back down somewhat. And then you see a nice little bump in the last 5 months over in Dorchester. And we'll talk about that, of what is causing that spike in Dorchester County here shortly. And this is again showing a permit trend. This is probably one of the bigger things that I've seen in the last 12 months that has really jumped up in our marketplace, is the number of permits. It's a pretty steep incline in permit activity. We'll get some raw numbers here shortly, but a good trend line. Permits are kind of, the first start. That's a confidence to me. It's a pre-sale, it's a confidence in the builder. And while that's probably reflected more in starts versus pre-sales this year, it shows where the market is and the confidence from our industry to go out and pull permits and get homes started. And then again, by county, while you saw earlier Berkeley leading, Charleston still leads in the number of permit activity. But you see Berkeley County taking a nice leap, and I can see them kind of taking over at this time next year as things start moving out into our Dorchester and Berkeley County regions for really our future. And then here's some raw numbers for you in terms of looking at the permits and closings. Really the aggressive, again, permits in the last 12 months, we've had over 1,700 more permits, where we're over now 6,500 permits if you're looking 12 months back. And closings have also grown to plus 600, and that puts us right around, we're flirting kind of every 2 months. I see these numbers when they get reported. While it was slightly under 5,000 at midpoint, we were slightly over in April. So we're bouncing right at 5,000 closings annually or 12-month cycle, and now pushing some pretty good permit numbers over 6,500. Again, good indicators for the future output and closing activity. Then we're going to jump and kind of look at some median and average sales prices by county. First of all, the average overall new homes through the end of June was just under 400,000, 398, 777. That's a good way to end the numbers, I guess, if you want to price things with triple sevens. That's up over $41,000 this time last year. And I think everyone in this room understands and knows where those prices have come. Not only obviously market conditions and demand, but more so in this room in the supply and the construction pricing that we've seen escalate since early this year. And looking at each county, Charleston at 461, that's a 36,000 increase over this time last year. Berkeley at 376 is a $40,000 increase. And Dorchester at 321 is a $24,000 increase over same time last year. Also want to look at, this is comparing builder or new home sales, the blue, versus red are showing the resales, and this is by county. And you can see, looking at this, first of all, Dorchester has the kind of biggest differential between new being at a higher percentage over the resales. And then you see just Berkeley just barely by less than $2,000 over more of a balanced market when you're comparing those two sectors of the market. And then in Charleston County, and it's not surprisingly here, obviously, when you look at coastal county, you're influencing by some big numbers on the beaches, Mount Pleasant, downtown kind of skews it, but it does show that, you know, it's a better value, I guess, if you want to point out, in new home sales numbers versus resales in terms of those average prices. But a good thing to look at and watch how that interacts with the resale market. I think more than ever, we are, as builders and as new homes professionals, we're really focused on the resale market, understanding what they're doing, even stealing some of their sales methods that we've come about, putting homes in the market and at certain later stages and taking the highest and best offer over a couple of days of showings. But watching that and watching the market conditions has been something that we really focused on in the last year. This is a trend line looking out over the last several years, 4 years of the new home average sales price. I mentioned that almost $400,000 number. 4.5 years ago, we were just over 300,000. So over a $90,000 increase in the average sales price in our region. But overall, you see the line is not dramatic. It has its ebbs and flows when you're looking at average sales prices. But again, over 4.5 years, it's increased by $90,000. This next one is an interesting kind of stacking chart that is showing the 3 county levels, and it shows the sales bands, the price bands of where the sales are in terms of average sales price. Not surprisingly, Berkeley and Dorchester, have the biggest stock in that $250,000 to $400,000 range. So more of their sales come in that measure, where Charleston County, the biggest in the far right side, that red is Charleston, is over 550. That's showing 550 plus. And again, this is new home sales by price bands in each county represented. Kind of highlights, obviously, we heard it early from Patrick, but the affordability, it puts more pressure where you're looking at today as a snapshot, new construction. If you're there, I think I found 2 homes yesterday of the available new homes, detached single family that were below 300,000. I think those were at 295 and 299. The entry level, or what I consider affordable when you look at wages, that 250 marker is always kind of jumps out no matter what year we're in. That's kind of a price band. That price band's going away, but those in our sector are attached. You're seeing majority townhomes, what I call suburban townhomes, out into Berkeley and Dorchester counties. Those are at 250. That's where our market is today. So that really highlights, more of a concern and need for our area when it comes to bringing that affordable workforce pricing into the marketplace. Now we're going to kind of take a little deeper dive, what I call the street level, just highlighting what's going on in each county. And again, this is kind of, the same thing you saw earlier, a little easier to read. Not surprisingly, the #1 position year over year has been Cane Bay. They went over 800 closings in the last 12 months. And that's the best 12-month period all time for this community. Cane Bay continues to grow. Last year, we talked about the Wildcat track, which is just to the left or west side of Cane Bay. That's in full development mode. Some sales are already happening, but that's really kind of Cane Bay phase 2. Well, most recently, Grambling Brothers just last month acquired what is known as the Daniels tract, which is almost 800 acres on the east side or closer to the 17A side of Cane Bay for our future development plans as well. So that continues to be a hot spot, will continue for the foreseeable future as it happens. With increasing housing in that area comes with obviously needs for schools and also road improvements. One of the last legs of the improvements to tie the Cane Bay kind of corridor into the new interchange through Nessen at 197, those are being completed right now. So there's new frontage roads being finished up in Cane Bay that will connect in to the Nessen Parkway side and take you out to all the way to Interstate 26. You're not having to bottleneck at Carnes Crossroads in the future. So the next thing we're going to start seeing is the widening of 176. That's obviously the back door also up to Volvo 176. So you're going to see that's kind of the next big infrastructure project in that region. And obviously with the houses that are there and the houses that are coming, it's definitely a needed thing. Also want to highlight a couple things. Kind of the other hot spot in that county is Nessen. We've watched Nessen grow over the last 5 or 7 years. Another kind of transition of ownership has happened in a short cycle of Nessen. It was sold to Brookfield Properties out of California earlier this year. It was also named the top master plan community by the National Home Builders Association. So quite an honor for this year, actually. Capstone is a group that is building a build for rent community in Nessen. Will open up next year, and that will have over 300 rental units in the community. MUSC is breaking ground in 2022. You also heard recent news about a Harris Teeter finally with plans to open up or build. And that community is about 25% built out as we stand today. And I just saw this morning, so one thing about these reports, you kind of have to wait to the last minute to compile a bunch of numbers. Well, my feed today showed that there's a new pickle bar. And that's a combination of the pickleball kind of phenomenon that's coming across the country, and a restaurant bar will be opening up in Nessen in 2022. So I continue to add all kind of interesting things in that community. But again, we'll have a lot to offer in different capacities and products and price points. The big news in Carnes this year, the remaining dirt was sold to Lennar, and that was just done in the last couple of months. So I haven't seen any revised plans on what their plans are, but they control the rest of that community. On the kind of south end side of the county, or going back more east, Daniel Island, which has been around for now 25 plus years, is heading towards its final end. I reported last year that East West Partners, a group that's doing a lot of high-end condo work, just recently started sales out at Kiowa, is finishing up or in the middle of developing and now building and selling the Waterfront, which is a community with a new restaurant. Some of you may have had a chance to go to King's Tide, just opened up. You can go by car, you can go by boat. It's one of the few restaurants truly in this region that you can do that. That is now opened up in the last year in the Daniel Island. Obviously, future-wise in the county, again, large, massive county, the Cainhoy region, I like to refer to it as Clements Ferry Road, places like UG, get used to hearing talking about UG. That's because it's here, it's there. The big Point Hope, or referred to as Cainhoy Plantation, 9,000 acre tract. It's a pretty big tract. Half of that's being set aside as a preservation area. But Daniel Island Development, who was behind, obviously Daniel Island, is heading up and overseeing Point Hope. It already has a lot of traction. If you haven't been out on Clements Ferry Road recently, a lot's happening with infrastructure, road widening, has all the schools in place. It's got shopping, public shopping center, apartments, and the first phase of residential started about this time last year or last fall. And it was a small piece, not to go into details on that, but they were able to sell it out, 60 lots in pretty short time. Most recent news in the paper, Del Webb has made application and they're heading to have their third community in the region out on that property, which will be over 1,000 homes. And there'll be much more coming to talk about as they get into next year, as they have more land available to develop and sell. Just down the road, up Clements Ferry Road, kind of going back towards 41, Wando Village is a new community by John Whelan. They recently acquired the property next door to expand that. But if you drive up 41, and not many people really drive up 41, my hometown's up 41. And if you drive up about another 5 miles, there are 3 more communities that are underdeveloped right now. So there's a lot of happening up in that region of the county. And then just kind of going to the more west side of the county, you'll be hearing about Holly Hill in the future. That's kind of the next destination in the county as we look outwards, where development back to 95. And that's kind of where that region will continue to grow. We'll be talking about that as we report in the next couple of years, because that's where we know Volvo's up there and a lot more distribution. That's really the name of the game in that corridor. You're going to hear about more and more distribution companies, which is jobs and housing needs as we venture out into those counties. Now I want to jump over to Dorchester. And I mentioned earlier, what was that spike we saw in the last 5 or 6 months? Well, reported last year, that's the time that Lennar bought the remaining land over at Summers Corner, and has really progressed, and the early this year opened up and has really surged forward. And you see that big bar, over 250 sales in Summers Corner. That's not all Lennar, but a majority of that is Lennar and their control, but they've really jumped out in that community and is now the top community in the county. And that has caused that nice bump they've seen in their sales activity. Obviously, also in Summers Corner, Lennar just announced they're jumping in and putting their feet in that 55 plus active adult market. They announced Horizons, that's their brand, will be coming out to that region later this year, early into next year. The Ponds is not far behind in terms of activity, with several builders in there, but also kind of heading towards the end of that community in due time. The shift in Dorchester County is, like Berkeley County, is really heading out. Ridgeville is like the new hot spot, like Johns Island was maybe 10 years ago. The mad rush is to put the flag out in Ridgeville. You've seen that heat map showed some indications of some opportunities and things that have been closing out, mainly in Carolina Bay with Center Park Homes and Eastwood. And also Center Park opened up Timothy Lakes about this time last year, another community right beside the new Volvo plant. And I know not many of you go out that way, but if you want to see what 3 million square feet look like in a distribution center, it's amazing what they've done and built up at that exit 187 exit in Ridgeville, the Walmart plant that will be opening up this coming spring and employing well over 1,000 people when it's all said and done. So a lot of, obviously, jobs will drive the dirt decisions and housing bills. And you'll see more happening. You know, the county seat, people think the county seat, if you're from around here, is Somerville. That's not the case. It's actually St. George, another name we're going to get used to hearing and talking about as we look into the future, where that growth as jobs and housing needs push out into St. George. So a lot of future growth that's coming in Dorchester. While it may be kind of the lower child on the rankings of the three counties, they're going to have a lot of to talk about in the next couple of years. And then finally, just want to highlight some things in Charleston County. The one thing on the map you'll see is that Oakfield kind of took over. That's a Pulte Syntex community on Johns Island. And Johns Island continues to be a bright spot. 2 of the top 5 communities in this region in Charleston County are in Johns Island. Kind of moving away from Johns Island. Recently, you've heard some things in the news about Long Savannah. There's a community, kind of a big community, was announced about 15 years ago, and it kind of got put on hold for various reasons. We'll be starting up in the next year. They've kind of cleared a lot of regulations and agreements that were mentioned, but that's over 4,000 homes on 3,000 acres, with about 1,800 of that being protected. So you'll start seeing everybody at Long Savannah. That's the Bees Ferry Road kind of corridor in West Ashland. When you jump across the bridge into the kind of East Cooper, now kind of East Cooper / Allendale region that we're seeing some growth into. Mainly you see in Mount Pleasant today, with some exceptions, are smaller infill pieces, less than 50 homes. Some of the most noted communities, Carolina Park in their Riverside community has some really strong sales this year, opened up the first waterfront, dockable waterfront lots in Sawyers Island, all pre-sold, all the lots, 25 of them sold in a couple of months early this year. And we are just announced that we'll be coming out with a new phase called Sawyers Bluff in this fall in Riverside. Also, another kind of large community for Mount Pleasant, Cahab has developed or still developing phases, but have started building and selling their Liberty Hill Farms, which is off of 6 Mile Road, right beside Oyster Point, kind of that middle of Mount Pleasant, where you're seeing over 300 lots of a mix of townhomes and single family, and they'll be starting to build and sell into the future there. We're also seeing movement in Charleston County on the south end. Hollywood has been a big place in the last year or two with builders, and recently you've heard some announcements about Ravenel, another town that we're going to get used to hearing about as we look in these outer regions or outer markets or fringe markets, if you're going to call it. And then on the north side of the county, while we're restricted further south of the Ace Basin, north side's very similar. We have Allendale. You're starting to see a lot of pressure mounting and a lot of new communities coming into that region. Some large land masses that are coming with new home development. So it's sprawling up 41, but it's also going out 17, with the exception you run to the national forest. So you run into some issues from a development standpoint, building standpoint, but that's where we're seeing some future growth in the Charleston County region. I'm gonna kind of summarize it by last couple of slides. This is looking at really the major 4 markets that we track in the state. Obviously, Charleston on your left, that really steady. This is showing the new home closings over 12 months, over year of the last 5 years. That little bump we saw, we were kind of hovering around 4,000. It had that bump up to 5,000. Myrtle Beach has been an area that you've really seen a good increase in the last 12 months. And then Columbia and then Greenville, you see some pretty big strides. They've had the biggest kind of upper momentum in the last 3 years, reaching over 6,000 new home closings in the last 12 months. So markets had a lot of good growth in the region. There's several of you in here who have operations in that market, and I can understand success. I just want to summarize with a couple of points, and then we'll pause and get Joey up here for any questions you may have in the audience. Obviously, I've mentioned this a couple of times, but I'm really starting to see and feel these outer markets, these fringe markets that we're seeing on the southern and northern ends of the Charleston County and pushing westward into the Dorchester and Berkeley. And my last really statement, and there's one builder in the room that's already kind of put their foot in this market, but you're really starting to see the Santee region. I'm a big believer for future. That Lake Marion area is going to be a destination not only for families and people that are working in that region and these distribution channels, but also from a retirement standpoint. But you're seeing a great growth into those markets as well. But overall, I think we still have, if we're going back to 2019 or settling back into that, that's kind of not a bad place to settle, because that was, again, one of our top markets. I think we could all use a little bit of catching our breath, and hopefully that will rebalance some of these supply chains and pricing markets as we look into the next year. So I just want to end by that, and thank you for your time today. And I'd like to bring Joey back up on stage. And if y'all have any questions, there's a microphone, but you can just stand up and just yell at us as well. Any questions?
I have a question about, for Joey, the increase in money supply as a result of all the stimulus. What is will have an effect that it evaporates over a short period of time, or will we see that money supply impact the economy, for the mid-range and further out?
So great question. So the question's about the money supply and the stimulus and its short and long run effects. I think that in the short run, I think it comes back to inflation and looking at how that has created an increase in demand by providing more financial resources. And that's a lot of what we've seen for the housing market over the last year, being essentially taking advantage of that with the higher disposable income, the higher savings rates, but also thinking about long run and where these dollars are flowing aside from consumer spending. And so we've seen a major contribution towards more asset-based activities. So the housing market, we've seen stocks that are being that the stock market is at an all-time high. And so these are trends that have resulted from stimulus, and the long-term effects will begin to see a pullback as we move into 2022. But looking forward over the long run, I think it's essentially over time, when you see a lot of debt and a lot of stimulus, and the long-term effects of that ultimately comes down to the fact that it's going to potentially cut into future growth. Again, we're talking 5-10 years down the road, because as we have to pay off that debt, that's just less we can do in other areas. So it basically just comes down to limiting our economic growth to the extent that we have to continue to pay that down in the future. So there are some long-run consequences to the short-term stimulus, but over the next year, again, we're seeing these dollars flow to consumers' pockets. We're seeing it flow into the stock market, and we'll begin to see somewhat of a pullback on both of those as the stimulus dollars fade.
How about supply chain, and as it relates to, are those the lower wage jobs as well? And if people aren't going back to work in those kind of areas, how does that impact supply chain to build, to get the product? I feel like maybe both of you can speak to that.
Yeah, I guess I'll take first stab at that. So supply chain issues are affecting multiple markets, as you know, and that's been a big hang up. The semiconductor shortage, probably the single having the biggest impact on most markets across the board. But that is something that's likely to continue for the rest of this year into 2022, based on estimates on when supply can be expanded, because in many cases it's a result of a lack of fixed assets. And so it just takes time to build up capacity to produce, to meet the demand that we need right now, which is why projections suggest that the supply chain shortages are likely to continue at least into early 2022. But these are markets that are expanding. So we think about the labor shortage. that's across the board, but that's especially concentrated in the service sector because of the lack of demand that we've seen over the last year, coupled with these other effects that we mentioned before, with more disposable income and the stimulus and also extended unemployment benefits, which just expired in June. All of those have provided disincentives for coming back into the labor market. So I think that's one area where we've seen a disincentive for workers. But if we look at the supply chain shortage there, we're seeing a ramp up in activity. The labor shortage is affecting the ability to scale up there, but it's more about fixed assets and just not having the capacity because this was in some sense unanticipated.
Oh, he said a lot for that answer. I agree. And I do think we are seeing, you know, for at least the next 6 or 9 months of trying to work through this, when we see maybe somewhat of a tapering on some pullback, and then the ability for the supply chain to, you know, the output to catch up. Again, some of it's related to labor, but I think more of it's, you know, related just to the increase of demand and trying to keep up with what's needed out in the field too. So hopefully, you know, first quarter next year, we see some adjustments there, some catching up.
Following up on that question, the gentleman just asked, how would you vary your answer based on supply chains relates to U.S. domestic manufactured products and products coming in from overseas? Does that make sense?
So how are the supply chain issues causing? Well, one answer.
The supply chain breakdown is in just the U.S. because it's coming from U.S. manufacturers, U.S. products, versus if it's coming from abroad.
So there are supply chain shortages in both categories. I think one way to look at how markets are responding is just to see whether or not particularly manufacturers in South Carolina and in the US are restructuring to deal with potential supply chain shortages in the long run. So in other words, are the supply chains more or less fixed in terms of the levels of efficiency? And is this a short-term blip, or is this causing more long-run restructuring with respect to the domestic versus international supply chains? And I think this is more right now in the category of a blip, you know, a blip of perhaps a year or longer. So it doesn't seem like a very quick or minor disruption. But the supply chain efficiencies that the U.S. has developed, and the South Carolina manufacturing especially, are very much have been established over a very long period of time. There are a lot of efficiencies there. And I don't see right now any real evidence that South Carolina manufacturers are restructuring to basically reshore their suppliers in a significant way. They're looking for additional backups, recognizing that the just-in-time delivery method, for example, does have limitations when we do see a major shift in a specific economic factor. So there's not a whole lot of preparatory time if they have to change. But in general, again, the efficiencies are so strong right now in terms of how the relationships are set up that I think once this temporary disruption is resolved, we're going to preserve the relationships that we have now. And with respect to international reliance on international supply chains and shipping versus what we rely on domestically.
I got a question for Will. The built to rent market, do you track that data, and do we have an idea of the permits that are out there, how many are going to build to rent, or any of the sales report, how many going to build to rent?
I haven't seen really any data to track on that. You know, I think it's probably still a little new, even though I think we're feeling it. If anything, that sector really is our biggest threat or competition in the land. You know, for a while there, they were just buying up distressed homes. You kind of post-recession, America's Home for Rent being a big player in that market early on. Everybody else is now created companies, but they shifted to then buying up maybe some distressed homes, new homes, partially developed communities, to now developing communities. So they're competing against our industry and buying dirt. And when you look at the simple, you know, numbers behind it, they're able to pay more for the dirt. They can monetize that house and rent it for 15, 20 years, whatever their projections are, and pay more up front. But you're seeing more and more of that creep. And that's not just here, it's across the country, but you've seen it when you see a community and Nessen being created, over 300 units, all rental. You know, you've seen smaller communities or some homes in this community under that kind of, that method, but you're seeing and hearing more about the build or rent. But I think it's more of a threat, or more of a competitive threat when it comes to land acquisition, and trying to find the dirt. We're competing against obviously each other, but that's another outside, you know, competitor we're seeing from a dirt perspective. But I haven't seen any firm numbers. Maybe Joey has, in terms of tracking that data, you know, how many permits of the total or that, from that standpoint. But I'm sure that's influencing some of our permit numbers, that kind of jump in 12 months.
Follow-up questions, Matt, if you will. Of the new homes that are being built and, you know, just the extraordinary numbers that are there, do you track how much of that is towards affordable housing or percentages against all of that inventory? What is
Well,
potentially being built as affordable housing as well?
Very little. I mean, if you saw that graph and you look by counting those price bands, when people define it differently. I define it kind of around that 250 number of sales price. You know, I've seen some focus in that, but it's such a small percentage. There's one builder that's focusing in the workforce housing space. That's kind of defined of that 80 to 120% of area median income. That's a blah, 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 but really amounts to what it's also referred to as the missing middle. It really, in our area, it means $60,000 to $100,000. And believe it or not, it's tough to buy a home when you're making that type of income, annual income. That's really where the focus is. And that kind of translates to that sub 300, 250, 275. And there's been some small movement, but that's really one of our greatest challenges, especially being a coastal community overall, is being able to bring more of that stock, because these jobs that are coming, you know, especially in the future, can't afford, you know, $300,000, $400,000 homes on those average wages that we see across our region. So more is needed, but it's not just home builders. We're a small bit of that. It really has to start with municipalities. It has to start with the local governments have to embrace it. You know, we've heard the word density. That's basically a 4-letter word in most municipalities today, but that's how you overcome infill. You know, these key words where you can go where you already have the services. You aren't having to build new roads and water and infrastructure. You can find opportunities that need 2 or 5 or 6 acres and create some affordable housing opportunities and for our workforce. That's really what when I hear affordable, there are different levels of it, but I focus more on that, the missing middle, or that, you know, that meat of the market, which translates to that sub 300. If you go back to that chart, there aren't many homes being created under 300,000. And that's largely due to dirt costs, development costs, construction costs. We just can't get there without everyone chipping in to drive that price down.
Do you think that's an opportunity for the association and working?
It's a huge opportunity. Something Patrick talked about earlier is kind of, you know, giving us points how it can all work, how everyone has to contribute, everyone, to drive down to that price.
Thank you, Joey. Thank you, Will. It's always a great informative opportunity to have you guys speak with us. I just wanted to remind you before you leave, we have our clay shoot tournament at the end of next month. If you haven't gotten a team yet, please do so. They're going to go fast. Also want to thank you all for joining us today, staying informed and being a part of the association. And with that, our meeting is adjourned.